I'm so excited to have Olivia Carril with us. She's a biologist and author of The Bees in Your Backyard, along with Joe Wilson, her co-author. Excellent book about bee identification. In fact, we're doing an intensive pollinator specialization class here in Ohio, meeting once a month throughout the year, and we're using Olivia's and Joe's book as our text. So we're so excited to have Olivia here to kind of break down the world of BID. Olivia's been working with bees for about 20 years, so she has extensive experience with bees and BID from the time she was an undergrad all the way up through her PhD. Lives in New Mexico. She does some great research out at the Grand Escalante National Monument. And she's coming to Ohio, actually, in early June to run us through some great one-day workshops, both time in the classroom, under microscopes, and out in the field. So you couldn't ask for a nicer day in June. We'll be at different locations in Ohio. And again, at the end of the program, I'll put a link on to give you more information if you'd like to join us for that. So at this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Olivia Carril. Olivia, thanks so much for being here with us this morning. It's a little earlier for you there in New Mexico.
Thanks, Denise. It's my pleasure to do it, no matter the hour. This is always fun for me. Yeah, I hope you guys will pardon my voice this morning. The bees are out here in New Mexico. Spring is well underway. The flowers are out, and all the little pathogens are out, too. And I'm just getting over a cold, but my voice doesn't quite sound normal to myself yet. So today I'm going to focus on identifying native bees that are common in the Great Lakes region, out where you are. This is an area I'm still getting to know, so I'm not real familiar with a lot of the species, but I can tell you a lot about the genera, the genus level identification, because it's pretty similar. I'm going to rely heavily on some of the stuff that's in the book that Joe and I wrote, so if you need a reference, you can always check that out from your library or go find one somewhere. If you want to look again, in addition, of course, to the PDFs. And I'm going to focus on characters that you can see from photographs. So sometimes bees flip from flower to flower pretty quickly, and it can be hard to get a good look, but with one still shot, you can often figure out what kind of bee you're looking at. So we'll focus on those a little bit today. So in case you wondered what I look like, this is me up in the upper, left-hand corner. With my girls, they do all of my collecting with me these days. And that's in Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, an area in north central New Mexico where I'm currently doing a bee survey. This is the cover of the book we wrote, and if you ever want to get in touch with me, you can find Joe and me on Facebook. Joe handles Twitter, so you can always send a tweet to him if you want. I'm not very good at that. We have a blog, and you can email me photos of bees if you are trying to figure out something out and want a little help. Feel free to email thebeesinyourbackyard@gmail.com, and I'm happy to help out if I can. So a lot of people wonder why we wrote a book about the bees in your backyard. It's a huge topic. It's kind of interesting. I guess the foremost reason is that I love bees and I love collecting information. So compiling those two things all together in one book was a fun experience for me. But the other big reason was that as I worked on learning about bees, I found that there were a lot of people really interested in bees who didn't have any sort of guide to really help them. Joe and I did a little survey a few years back where we asked people 3 questions. And the first question we asked was, how many bees do you think there are in the United States? How many bee species? And most participants guessed there were something less than 500 species. In fact, most people guessed there were something less than 20. Of course, the actual number is somewhere closer to 4,000. So most people weren't aware of the diversity of bees that exist in the U.S. and also in Canada. Then we asked people, given a series of images, if they could tell us, circle which ones were bees and which ones weren't bees. And people did pretty good at identifying that a fly, a butterfly, and a grasshopper were not bees. That went pretty well. Most everyone's able to recognize a bumblebee, a honeybee, and even a sweat bee. Most people did pretty good at that. But there were a lot of bees that were fairly common. You can see these all around the Great Lakes region. You can see them all across the country. And a lot of people weren't aware that those are also bees. And some things that aren't bees, like velvet ants, I think they're called cow killers back east. People thought those were bees when in fact they aren't. So we felt there was a little bit of work to be done in sort of helping people learn something about these equally common but less often noticed, I guess. And the last question we asked on our survey of, what was it? 1,200, 1,400 people. On a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think bees are? And almost every single participant on that scale of 1 to 5, 5 being most important, said that bees were very important. So even without knowing what a bee looks like, without knowing how many there were, people recognize the value of these little creatures. So we thought a book to kind of bridge that gap might be good. So I guess step 1 is to make sure we all know what a bee is. These are all commonly talked about, different kinds of bees. Of course, down in the lower right corner, you have the honeybee. There's a carpenter bee going, clockwise. A carpenter bee, a bumblebee, a squash bee, and there in the middle is a sweat bee, a little tiny sweat bee. All of these are bees, but they don't look very similar to each other. So the question is, what unites all of these things together under the category of bee if they look so different from each other? And what's more, how is it that one of these is a bee and one of them is a wasp? What actually separates bees from wasps? Well, if you look at the insect family tree, you find that bees and wasps are actually grouped together down here in the order Hymenoptera. This is a distinction they also share with ants and sawflies and a couple other little groups. And if you zoom in on that particular branch, we used to think that ants and bees were sort of cousin to all of the wasps. So the wasps formed one big group, the bees were a group by themselves, and the ants were. But some pretty recent phylogenetic evidence shows that, in fact, bees and ants both are embedded within the wasp, all wasps. All of these things are tangled together in this strange network, and it's really hard to separate out wasps from the bees. In fact, if you talk about this from a phylogenetic standpoint, it means that bees are, in fact, a kind of wasp, just a wasp that is specialized to collect pollen instead of being a predator, a meat eater, like all of the wasps are. So people always wonder, how in the world would this come to be? How does a bee emerge evolutionarily? How would it come to be? We don't really know for sure, but we can kind of guess. If you go back in time, we know that the first big flowering plants occurred about 125 million years ago. We can find evidence in the fossil record for these giant flowers, sort of disc-shaped with a ball of pollen in the center, pretty similar to modern-day magnolia flowers. And these would have made great landing pads for a lot of different insects, looking for a mate, looking for a place to rest, or if you were a predator, like wasps, of course, were and are, a great place to find a meal. And it's thought that somewhere along the way, one of those predatory wasps, the larvae, of course, feed on the prey that the wasp brings back to the nest, and it's thought that the larvae developed a preference for the pollen that was on the body of the insect rather than the insect itself. Seems a little far-fetched, but in fact, a lot of the necessary compounds, growth hormones, and stuff like that needed to turn a wasp larvae into an adult wasp are present in both pollen and in the insect body. So maybe not that far-fetched. And in fact, this switch from being a predator to being a pollinator has happened more than once. There is a group of what is still considered wasps called Pseudomyceras that specialize particularly on penstemon flowers. So it's happened more than one time. And by about 100 million years ago, we see the first true bee fossil. And we know it's a bee because it has specialized hairs for collecting pollen and some of the other characters on the body that are unique to bees. And by about 60 million years ago, we see in the fossil record that both bees and flowers have diversified and co-radiated around the globe, across the world. And so today, we find roughly 30,000 bee species on Earth. I should say we find between 20 and 30,000 species. We have names on a little over 20,000, but we expect there are many undescribed and undiscovered species. In the U.S., there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 species. East of the Mississippi River, there's about 770 species. And then I put a breakdown there for each of the Great Lakes states. And all of these are very approximate. I think Michigan has an actual number now, maybe a couple of those others too, but most of the areas haven't been thoroughly studied just for their state, and so we're still learning what all is in each of those states. So how do we identify a bee? One of the things that bees often get confused with is flies. So here's a couple of the characters you can look for to know whether a picture that you're looking at or an actual insect on a flower is a bee or a fly. First of all, bees, of course, are in the business of collecting pollen, and so on their back legs or sometimes on the abdomen, you'll find stiff pollen collecting hairs. That's what's right here. Those pollen collecting hairs are unique to bees, and you'll never find them on flies. You can see here this fly has a bare back leg. Look for longer antennae. Bees have very long antennae. The antennae, of course, are the organ that they use to smell flowers. They have lots of odor receptors there. Fly antennae are quite short, real stubby, and they're often real close together on the top of the face. The eyes on flies tend to be bigger and almost converging on the top of the head, whereas there's often more separation on the bee. The wasp of the fly tends to be a little bit thicker also. This isn't always true, but quite often. And on a bee, this maybe isn't the best picture for it, but you can often see sort of a separation between the abdomen and the thorax. Okay. And of course, the big thing is flies are in the order Diptera, a word that if you break down, di means two and ptera means wings. So they have two wings, one on either side of the body. You can see them here, 1, 2. And bees have 4 wings. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And those wings are called the forewing and the hind wing. So they have 2 wings on either side of the body. Now on to something a little trickier. Because bees are technically a kind of wasp, differentiating between bees and wasps can be a little bit tricky. I'll let you look at this picture for a minute and take a guess in your head just how many of these you think are bees and how many are wasps. And then I'll circle for you. These ones are bees. The others, of course, are wasps. This can be tricky. Of course, the one in the lower right corner, this one's clearly a bee. I mean, 1, because I told you, and 2, because it has that nice, fluffy, flying teddy bear look of the bee. But these others, they're not very hairy. There's no pollen-collecting hairs on the back legs. They can be a little more difficult to distinguish or identify as bees. And there's reasons in each case for why they don't have that more typical bee look. This one up here is a male. Male bees don't collect pollen, so you don't find those pollen-collecting hairs on the back leg. This one is we'll talk about this guy a little bit more later on. This is a clown-faced or yellow-faced bee called Hylaeus. And Hylaeus ingest the pollen inside their bodies and carry it back in their crop where they regurgitate it. So again, the outside of the body has no need of pollen-collecting hairs. And then this one, which we'll also talk about a little later on, is a kleptoparasite. And so they sneak into the nest of another bee and lay eggs on the pollen that she's gathered for her own offspring, that a mother's gathered for her own offspring. So again, no need of those pollen collecting here. Okay, so if you were to ask a taxonomist how you might go about identifying a bee from a wasp, they would give you this very irritating answer that somewhere on the body of a bee, you'll find a split hair, a split end, so to speak. And if you look at a wasp, you don't find that. Often on these bees that don't have very much hair, the place to look for that is on a structure called the pronotal lobe, which you can see here in yellow, sort of the shoulder, the epaulet you can think of. Not quite the epaulet. A little in front of where that would be on a bee. And you can see on the right-hand side there, it's very fuzzy. And where on the same structure on the wasp on the left side, those same hairs are very, very simple. It doesn't have that fuzzy look to it. So this isn't going to work unless you have a microscope and lots of patience. Other things you can look for in the field or in pictures are that wasps often have silver hairs on their faces, and so when they're rooting around on a flower, you can see those hairs glint in the sunlight. They give it kind of a reflective mirror-like almost appearance. Not all wasps have this, but enough of them do that it's a character you can use. If you see metallic hairs on the face, you know it's not a bee because bees never have that. And I think that behavior is really telling. Sort of the look of the wasp body is indicative of its lifestyle as a predator. It has these long, spiny legs lots of little spines for collecting or for grabbing onto a prey and hanging onto it really tight. Very few hairs, so it's extra streamlined. Then, of course, the bee is busy flitting from flower to flower as fast as possible. Lots of fuzz on its body and a real focus on the flowers. Okay, so let's go over what the 6 families are that you can find in North America. The first one is Andrenidae, and I'm going to just zip through these. We're going to get into detail on them. Megachilidae, Halictidae. This one messed up. We'll just skip that. Here we go. Colletidae, the Apidae. This is a real big family that includes the honeybees, the carpenter bees, the bumblebees, and then the Melissodes, and the E cut off the end. I'm not going to talk about Melissodes today. It's a pretty rare bee family. We don't see it very often. But we'll talk about a couple members of each of the other groups. So just to give you a size range for bees, on the big end in North America, they're a little bit bigger than a quarter. That's a carpenter bee. And out here in New Mexico, the smallest bee in North America is Perdita minima. And you can see it's much smaller than a quarter. Back east, they don't get quite that small, but that just gives you a sense of the range. So let's start with the Andrenidae bee family. I'm not going to go over all of these. That would join us in Ohio when we go out in June, and maybe you can hear more about some of these others. But we'll go over some of the more commonly seen ones, Andrena and Coleopsis. And we'll talk about, for the Coleopsis, one particular species. So overall, and I know it seems like overkill to really talk about some of these things, but the Andrena have pretty round faces and this very round oval face. And that gets important when trying to distinguish between the Andrena and the Colletidae, which we'll talk about a little later on. The eyes are real parallel-sided, so they match each other pretty well. And then if you were to look under a microscope, you would notice that they have 2 subantennal sutures, which is, interestingly enough, a character they share with wasps, but not with any of the other bee groups. So let's talk about one big group that's pretty common out east. They're small to medium size. They can get pretty tiny. What would I say? You know, maybe 1/3 of an inch in size at the small end, but a couple of them are bigger than a honeybee, so there's a big range. They often have a little bit of fuzz on them. Some of them are fuzzier than others. So, for example, you can see this one here has got a nice orange tint to it. It looks more fuzzy. They often have teardrop-shaped abdomens to me. The abdomen is kind of distinctive in that it has this round and comes down to a nice little point at the bottom. Very curvy, nice hourglass figure sort of look to them. And they're often kind of shiny. They've got a bit of a shine to them. All Andrena nest in the ground and sometimes in aggregations, so you may find a whole bunch of individuals in one area, all with these little, almost like miniature ant mounds in the ground. They're mostly out in the spring, but there are some summer and fall flyers. And many Andrena are specialists. So if you can tell what flower it's on, that may help you narrow down what kind of species it may be. So, one of the most important, and that's why I have it 4 times on this one slide, ways to identify an Andrena and know that you're looking at an Andrena or a mining bee is what we call facial fovea, which is a fancy scientific way of saying eyebrows. And these eyebrows in particular run up and down the face, so they're vertical rather than horizontal like ours are. So I'm going to use this pointer again. Up here, this picture in the upper right corner is not marked up, and you can see this little bit of gray kind of behind here. And if you look at the same exact picture, we've kind of colored it in here, that pink area, that fuzz underneath in the little tiny groove beside the eyes is called the facial fovea. I find one of the easiest ways to see this is by looking down on the head of the bee. And so you can, right down here in the lower left corner, you can see that facial fovea colored in just a little bit lighter. And then just to show you that you really can't see it on a flower, if you look at the lower right corner, there's a bee on a flower, and you can see very clearly those vertical eyebrows running down beside each eye. And that really is something you can see in photos and can help you in IDing a bee if you missed it while it was on the flower. So another bee in the Andrenidae family to keep your eyes out for is Calliopsis andreniformis. And I pulled out this one in particular because when you find it in abundance. Many, many, many individuals. It likes disturbed sites and open fields. So if you're working or looking around in an open, disturbed field, this is a very common visitor. They're pretty small. These guys are less than a half an inch. The female has 3 stripes on the lower portion of the face. I should say they're not stripes, they're actually spots, as you can see in the lower left corner there. But if you look at the bee from above, it often looks like they have 3 stripes kind of running down the face on the female. And the male can be identified by those bright yellow legs, bright yellow antenna, and the bright yellow clypeus. Clypeus is that front nose piece. Okay, so moving on to the next bee family. This is the Colletidae. The Colletes, there's 2 groups in the east. Well, there's 3. There's the Copulocana, but you won't find them up in the Great Lake regions. So where you are, there's 2 big groups, the Colletes, which are sometimes called polyester bees or cellophane bees, and the Hylaeus, which are the yellow-faced or yellow-masked or clown-faced bees, any one of those combinations. And they look nothing alike. It seems odd that they are united together in one family. The thing that pulls them together, above all else, is that if you look at the tongue, it's split. A little like a snake, more rounded, but a little like a tongue on a snake has a fork to it. These guys have the same thing. But they don't look very similar to each other. So rather than looking at a bee and saying, oh, it looks like it's in the Colletidae bee family, it's better just to learn to recognize the 2 groups, the 2 genera. So we'll start with Hylaeus. These guys are usually very small. So that picture on the lower left is a Hylaeus on a Queen Anne's lace. Daucus, I think, is the genus. And that gives you a sense for the size because you know how big those flowers are. I think the most distinctive things on them are, one, you never see the scopa, the small little black bees, like matte black bee, but that on the face you often see yellow markings. Interestingly, those yellow markings often are near the eyes, whereas most bees, if they have yellow on the face, it's in this region in the middle here. Hylaeus differ in that the yellow, when it's on their faces, is quite often over here on the sides, which is unique to Hylaeus. Okay. Oh, and I should mention, just so you know, Hylaeus often nest in twigs. They're all twig nesters, so these are one of the ones that you might find coming out of pithy stems from last year's perennial plants. Colletes, of course, is the other group. These are the cellophane or polyester bees. And here's where knowing something about the head shape can be important. If you look at this, here's this Colletes here. I'm turning on my pointer. The Colletes, see how the eyes angle toward each other? And it gives the face this overall sort of heart shape. It looks like the bee has a heart-shaped face. There's no facial fovea by the eyes. None of that dense, thick, matted hair running right next to each eye. But the eyes really do angle towards each other. And that can be very distinctive in a photo and give you a clue that you're looking at a Colletes. The other thing to look for on these guys is what we call the second recurrent vein. It's a fancy word. Don't try and remember it. But so on a wing, you have these 3 cells on the second row here. And at the start of the 3rd row, or end of the 3rd row, this vein right here on most bees is perfectly straight. Whereas on the Colletes, it has this beautiful S shape to it, this big old curve. And that curve is very distinctive to Colletes, and believe it or not, can even be seen in photos. I zoomed in on this picture of this Colletes, and lo and behold, I could see that curved vein right there on this photo. So don't discount those wing features. Sometimes they're more visible than you might think. So from a distance, they do look a lot like Andrena. They fly about the same speed. They're both very fuzzy, and they also nest in the ground, sometimes in aggregations. But looking for that heart shape and keeping your eye out for the second recurrent vein can be very useful. Characters. Okay, so one of the most common Colletes that you might see in the Great Lakes region is Colletes inaequalis. They fly from April through July. They are generalists, but they often seed on willow, so they may have a slight preference for that, so keep your eyes peeled for that. They nest in aggregations, and those stripes that run across the abdomen are pretty distinctive. These ones here can be one way to kind of narrow down. So if you figured out it's Colletes and you see those white stripes really distinctively on the abdomen, you're probably looking at a Colletes. Okay. So on to the third bee family. This is the Halictidae. In the East, these are very common. I should also mention that they are abundant. When you find one of any of these groups, you find 1,000. This is a group that includes all of the sweat bees. It includes the green metallic sweat bees, the normal sweat bees, the small sweat bees. All of them are in here. Some of these exhibit a bit of sociality. It's variable from species to species and even within the environment. Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. But a very interesting group. And again, you know, there isn't one feature that sort of unites them all together. But one thing that you can look for, and here we are back at looking at wing venation, is, so you have those 3 submarginal cells again. The wing on the next row down again. On most bees, this is straight. Whereas on the Halictidae, all of them, it has this nice curve right there. That curve is really distinctive in photos because even when the bee folds its wings across its back, that part doesn't have a lot of veins underneath it, so you can see it pretty clearly. There are a couple groups where it's not quite as commonly seen. But overall, that little curve in the vein is a good sign that you're looking at a Halictus. This is a very big bee family. It's well represented here, but it's got a lot of interesting representatives around the world. So let's look at some of the big genera within this. Halictus is extremely common. These are kind of brown, nondescript bees. They're often seen in abundance. They fly from probably May through September. Because some species are a little bit social, you often see them flying for a longer period of time. And in addition to that vein feature that we were talking about, the other thing you can look for is these stripes across the abdomen. Lots of bees have stripes across the abdomen, but Halictus have really thick hair running across the end of each of the segments that makes up the abdomen. So if you think about it, the abdomen's kind of collapsible, kind of like one of those camp cups you had when you were little. Each segment can kind of collapse into the one before it. And if you think about the placement of those bands at the end of each of those segments, it means that even if this were to sort of collapse in on itself and not be all the way stretched out, those hair bands would still be visible. An alternative bee, and we'll talk about it here in a minute, is one that has the hair running across the beginning of each of those tergal segments. And on those bees, of course, if you were to collapse the abdomen down, the hairband would disappear and you wouldn't be able to see it. So it's pretty distinctive to me. I'm looking at this bee and those strong stripes are really apparent here on the end of each tergal segment. And of course, they also have that arcuate vein on the wing. Okay. One of these guys, Halictus ligatus, is very, very distinctive. And the reason is that at the end of what you might think of as the jawline on a bee, there's a little point. And this can be seen in flowers. When the bee's on a flower, kind of rooting around, if you take a picture of it, then you can see that very pointy little hook off the back. So that's a good way to know this particular species of Halictus. And again, if you look at this, you can see all of those hair bands right at the end of each tergal segment. So let's compare that to Lasioglossum. Lasioglossum is a big group, but the most common subgenus within this, the most commonly seen kind of Lasioglossum, is Halictus. They used to be their own genus and got lumped into the bigger group Lasioglossum. And these guys also have that curve in the wing. You can see right here. Cursor down here. Got that basal vein with the big old curve in it right there. To me, if you were to take that wing and stand it on end, this shape, the shape of this cell, looks like a lady on her tiptoes in a pointy boot. It looks like a tiptoeing foot to me. I don't know if that works for any of you, but that might be helpful. You can look for, to tell the subgenus Dialectus, you can look at the fact that one of the submarginal cell veins is strong where the other two are weak, but we're not going to get into that too much today. The other things to look for are those hair bands, and these guys have that kind of deep, thick fuzz at the beginning of each tergal segment instead of at the end, so it gives it a very different look when you're looking at it here compared to the Halictus, which is sometimes gets confused for. Lasioglossum, I should point out, are often metallic. They have a little bit of a gunmetal blue or green color to the thorax, which you don't usually find in Halictus. They may have a slight metallic tinge to them, but not as strongly as the Lasioglossum often. Okay. So let's look at green metallic sweat bees. These are all different kinds. On the top row, we have 3 members within the genus Agapostemon, and the two with the one in the middle there is a male, so it's got that yellow and black striping on its abdomen. It tells you it's a male. The females may either have black and white stripes across the abdomen, or more commonly, they're entirely green, like this one over here on the right, upper right. This, all green underneath. So that can make them hard to tell from the other big group of green metallic sweat bees, which is the bottom row, and those are all in the tribe Agapostemon. So if you want, you can just be happy that you have identified it as a green metallic sweat bee and stop there. And let me just point out, since you can see all of these wings, look, there's that curved basal vein there. You can see that same vein there, and you can see it here. So you actually can see it in photographs. Even on flowers, you can see that curved basal vein that's unique to all Halictidae, including the green metallic sweat bee. If you want to get real particular and figure out which kind of green metallic sweat bee you're looking at, there are 2 things really to look for. First of all, to me, the Agapostemon, that bottom row, they look extra polished. They look really, really shiny to me. There's a difference in sort of the metallic coloration of the abdomen compared to the Agapostemon. They often have a little more of a bluish tinge in my eye, but maybe that's just my eye. The other thing to look for is on the Agapostemon, there's a very strong ridge outlining the very back section of the thorax right here. See this black ridge running all the way around? And it's strong enough you can actually see it in the photos of the bee. Whereas if you look at this one, it's very smooth right here. You can't really see that ridge as clearly. Here again is that ridge right there. The Agapostemon don't have it. So if you can zoom in on your photo and identify even a portion of that ridge, that tells you you're looking at Agapostemon. Another thing you might consider looking for is the eyes on the Agapostemon often have sort of a notch to them. So rather than being smooth and running continuously down the face like this, there's a bit of a notch. And it's stronger in some kinds than others, so this may not help you, but in a lot of the Agapostemon, there is a bit of a notch in. So something to keep your eye out for. So moving on to the Megachilidae bee family, there's a lot of these in the East. We're not going to go over all of these. Some of them are really difficult to distinguish between, but we'll just cover a couple of them that are really obvious. And there's a couple characters to look for to tell you that you're looking for a bee in the Megachilidae. First and foremost is that these guys carry, the females that aren't parasites, carry their pollen on their bellies. So you can see all this yellow down here is pollen. She carries it on the underside of her abdomen instead of on her legs. So if you see a bee with a yellow underside, you know you're looking at a bee in the Megachilidae. Obviously, males and kleptoparasites won't have that. Other things you can look for are the mandibles. These guys have big, thick mandibles. Other bees maybe just have like a little one point, just one little point. These guys have 1, 2, 3, almost 4 teeth on this one. Some of them have more teeth. Very wide, very robust mandibles. And on the wing, they often have, or they always have, only 2 submarginal cells. So you can kind of see that here, 1, 2 submarginal cells. Rather than on some of the other bees, and you can go back on your little PDF if you printed it out and see those other ones, have 3 submarginal cells. Many of these guys nest in twigs or in wood, or if you have a bee house, bees in the Megachilidae may be the ones that you see visiting. So let's look at a couple of the genera here. The yellow and black ones that you see all summer long, flying around, oftentimes sort of hovering near plants that are in full bloom, maybe looking a little bit aggressive, with yellow and black markings like tiger stripes across them. These are in the Anthidium tribe, and most commonly out east they are Anthidium. There are other groups within this, but that's the most common one that you'll see. So the Anthidium, often called wool carder or resin bees, the most distinctive features really are the fact that these guys are yellow and black striped. They have these burly little bodies. They're very round. They look, if bees had muscles on the outside, they look muscular almost. And here you can see this female has collected some, like almost cotton, some fuzz off of a plant, and she's taking it back into her nest hole to sort of pat it. So let's talk about the most commonly seen Anthidium, which interestingly enough is an invasive. Came over from Europe maybe 30 or 40 years ago and has made its way all the way across to the west. It started in the east. And these guys, the males, are especially aggressive. They use those teeth that you can see right here on the end of the abdomen to pierce their enemies. And an enemy is anyone who invades the territory of the flowers that they've sort of staked out as theirs, where they're waiting for a female to come that they can mate with. And they'll use those teeth to pierce the body of another insect, maybe another bee, maybe something else, and often can kill it. They're large. They're a little bigger than a honeybee. They fly very fast. They're loud. You can hear them. This is the most easy to identify Anthidium. In the east, there's actually 4 species of Anthidium. 2 of them are native and 2 of them are invasive. Megachile, these are a little tricky. There's no real good characters to see from pictures to really help, but they're very distinctive in that you can sort of rule out all of the other groups and you're left with the Megachile. They have a very round, sort of chunky shape. You can see it when they fly. Each of the body parts is really round abdomen. They don't look flattened the way the Andrena and the Colletes do. When you look at them sort of from the top down, they don't have any sort of teardrop shape to them. They're almost cigar-shaped, really, just this round submarine look to them. They're usually fairly dark in color. They'll have a lot of fuzz on them. Sometimes it's blonde, sometimes it's black. It can vary. And these are the ones you'll often see visiting your roses or various other plants in your garden, specifically to pull off leaf material, which they cart home underneath their bodies like this, take into their nest, and make sort of wallpaper nurseries that they put their little babies in. Osmia is another Megachilidae that's pretty commonly seen. These guys usually have a nice metallic blue or green tint to their bodies, as you can see in the upper right corner. Not all of them. There are black species, so keep your eye out for that, but a lot of them are sort of this blue-green sort of color. The way that you would know, and you can see this in a picture, I did this just the other day, you can tell whether a bee is a Megachile, which may look similar, or a Osmia, is on the thorax. If you can see in the picture, most bees on their thorax, on their back, sort of where the shoulder blade would be, there's a long groove, a line running down the back right here like this. And you can see it on most bees pretty distinctively. On Osmia, they don't have that line. All they have is a little tiny dot right there, just one dot. So if you can't see the line running down the back of the thorax, that tells you you're probably looking at an Osmia. If you're trying to decide between, say, Megachile and Osmia, that might be something to help you. They often have little clubs on their antenna, as you can see here. There's a little club shape on the end. So that might help clue you in. Look at this. Even on this face, you can see those mandibles are real thick, characteristic of the Megachilidae bee family. You can see that. Okay. Last bee family, this is the Apidae. This is a huge family. It includes, of course, the honeybee. I'll give you a second to see if you can find it all by yourself. It's right here. It includes the carpenter bees, squash bees, bumblebees, several parasitic bees. These are all parasitic bees. It includes the mini carpenter bee. This is a Ceratina. It includes the longhorned bees and so many more groups that aren't even on here. It's very diverse. They don't look very similar to each other at all. In some cases, it's almost easier to learn to recognize the genera than it is to try and find the family first. In the East, there's 29 genera. It includes several you know probably pretty well, including the carpenter bee, of course, the bumblebees. Nomada, which is a big kleptoparasite that parasitizes biting bees. The Ceratina, the honeybees, the Melissodes. Very diverse. They range from being highly social, like the honeybee, which is probably the epitome of socialization in bees, down to solitary, and it includes broad generalists as well as specialists. Many of these bees are really large, very fuzzy, and fast flying. So if you see something with that sort of flying teddy bear shape to it, you're probably looking at something. So let's look at a couple. Bombus, this is the bumblebees. There's many species back east. Here are a couple things that set the bumblebee apart from others. First of all, when they collect pollen, rather than collecting it into pollen collecting hairs, they collect it into a special little scoop, like a spoon, on the back of their leg called a corbicula. And you can see it's kind of this shiny, dented-in region on the back of their leg. That corbicula is distinctive to the bumblebee, and you won't find it on carpenter bees. So if you see a really big bee flying fast around, you're trying to decide between the two. If you can see that shiny spot on the back of the leg, that tells you it's a bumblebee, a female. Also, when they collect their pollen, you can see they collect it as this sort of muddy mass. So it's pollen and nectar mixed together and packed onto the leg right here. And so that tells you also that it's a bumblebee. If you see sort of hairs with dry pollen grains tucked into them, then it's not a bumblebee. They have really long faces, mostly due to the fact that when the eyes quit, there's a lot of surface area here before the jaw begins. Other bees, the jaw starts right here, right where the eye ends. And so that long, what we call as a malar space, can tell you often that you're looking at a bumblebee if you're not sure. And if you look at the wing, the hind wing, most bees, there's actually a whole other piece right here, a big lobe called the jugal lobe. And honeybees, or bumblebees, don't have it at all. It's completely missing. So those are all features you can look for depending on the angle of the photo you have or how you're looking at your bee. One of the most commonly seen bumblebees in your region is Bombus impatiens, which can be distinguished pretty easily by the fact that she has yellow. You notice in some of these pictures back here, you have yellow and orange on the abdomen. There's all sorts of different color patterns here. Bombus impatiens has yellow just on that very first tergal segment. Yellow, blonde, straw-colored, whatever you want to call that. But that's the only spot that she has that yellow coloration. That can clue you into that particular species. And look at this. You can look at the leg right here, and you can see that there are no pollen collecting hairs, but this smooth surface right here and here. It tells you you're looking at a bumblebee. Let's compare that to the other real big bee that flies at the same time. This is the carpenter bee. Carpenter bees, first of all, look at the head. See how round it is? This is a really round head right here. The eye ends and the jaw immediately begins. It's shaped almost exactly like the hole that she's probably built in your deck. Right there, in the gazebo. Whatever wood structure she's chosen. If you look at the back leg, you can see there's hairs running all up and down it, real stiff hairs. You can even see it in this out-of-focus picture back here. And she has grains of pollen tucked in there rather than that mat of nectar and pollen mixed together. And then if you look at the hind wing, she has that little lobe. It's very small on the Xylocopa, on the carpenter bees, but it is there. There's this tiny little lobe. So if her wings are folded up, you can look for that, which you won't find on the honeybee. Okay. Another thing to look for, if you're, oftentimes when bees are rooting around on flowers, if you manage to get close, it's because their heads are down in the flower and they can't see you. So you often see the hind end. One thing to look for with the Xylocopa, the carpenter bee, is the fact that the abdomen doesn't have much hair on it, so it really reflects light well and very, very shiny and black. Melissodes, the females of these are actually pretty difficult to tell. If you see a pretty big bee flying, a lot of them are specialists on sunflowers. So if you see a big bee flying in the fall or in late summer and it's on sunflowers, it probably is a Melissodes. But the females can be a little tricky to tell apart, but the males, so if you see females and you're not sure, but right next to her is a male with these antennae like this, that's pretty distinctive. There isn't any other bee that has antennae quite that long. That's really common and abundant and flying in summer and fall. Okay. And it would be wrong not to mention, of course, Nomada. Nomada is a kleptoparasite, and it's a really common one. This does not parasitize a bee in the Apidae. These guys parasitize the Andrena, those mining bees that we started with. So if you find an aggregation of mining bees of Andrena all together nesting in the ground, you can see their little sort of ant mound or bee mound homes. Females are going in and out of them. And you see these little yellow and black or red and yellow bees sort of hovering at the sidelines. They look a little sneaky. Can't quite tell what they're doing. Very likely it's a Nomada. They only parasitize Andrena, and they will hover and hang out a lot near the homes of those. So this is one that has kind of a wasp-like look to it, but is actually a bee. So I'm guessing you're all feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this information. Remember, you can go back and refer to it. I think really the secret is to start seeing the bees. Head outside as much as possible and just watch what happens, and you'll start to notice some of these, and you'll start to notice by yourself the differences between them. So I'm going to give you a little quiz here at the end. You can do this by yourself wherever you are, just to make you feel better about how well you know bees. So here's a lovely poster that I found online that says, "Save the bees, save humanity." So the question to you is that a bee? And the answer, of course, is no. It is not a bee. You probably all recognize that at this point because it has those long legs with lots of spines on it. Here's another one. It says, "Save the bees." This is a shirt you can buy online for a lovely $25.49. That is not a bee. That's a cicada. Here's another fun one. I'll let you take a moment. Look, decide whether you think this is a bee or not. And here are a couple things to look for. Remember this right here. These antennae are very small, tiny little things. The eyes are real big. No pollen collecting hairs, even though it's dusted with pollen. And in fact, this is a fly. Flies are actually, they pollinate. They definitely are pollinators. But I think the sentiment here was a sentiment I've heard before, which was if bees go away, we won't have any pollinators for all of our many lovely fruits and vegetables that we enjoy. So I think they missed the boat with that one. And then here's one I found. This is on Amazon. This is a Melissa and Doug puzzle that you can get. So it says here, snack bee and flower. So you can get this sunflower snack bee. Look at it real close. Of course, that is also not a bee. That one is a fly too. So you probably got all of those right. You should feel very good about yourself. If you want to start seeing these guys around your yard so that you can learn how to tell them all apart, here are some things you can do. It's actually pretty simple. Bees they take care of themselves pretty well. The best things you can do, of course, are providing a home. Any earth will do. Some of them like lawns, some of them like bare earth, some of them like railroad beds, some of them like a little bit of slope, some like sand. You can't really decide. Remember, we're talking about 500 species in one state alone. So picking one thing that will appeal to all of them isn't going to happen. But the main point would be that it should be undisturbed. Limit the weed barrier. It's really hard for bees to chew through that to make their homes in the ground. And of course, you can provide cavities for them. Logs. You can drill your own holes or find one that already has some in it. Twigs. Put in a bee house. Put in some bamboo. You can even use, out here anyway, adobe bricks with holes put in it. Of course, after a home, also provide food. Blossoms that go from the beginning to the end. Remember that, of course, bees are flying from the time the first flowers come out, before the trees even leaf out, all the way through the fall. So provide something for them to eat all season long. I suggest a diversity of colors shapes, sizes, and of course plant families. There are specialists that go to each of the different plant families. Different bees like different colors and shapes. And I know that sounds overwhelming. It's okay to start small. Make yourself just a little pot. Put a couple of flowers in it. Maybe sunflower, maybe mint, something like that, and see what comes. And the last thing, of course, would be don't kill them. Anything you can do to minimize the use of poisons, especially insecticides around your home, is probably going to help them. And that's all I have. So Denise will help us with some questions, but I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Great, thanks so much, Olivia. You know, every time I hear a bee expert like yourself, one of my bee heroes, I'm always interested in pronunciation. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's sometimes intimidating for folks who are trying to learn bees and get a handle on bees. Can you share a little perspective on the pronunciation of some of that Latin?
Yeah, so you're talking like the words Xylocopa, Andrena, Colletidae, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So remember, these are all Latin and Greek-based words. I like to remind myself that those are the way we talk about them. Those are dead languages. So no one can correct you because there's no person alive that knows what it should sound like. So don't feel too bad. Experiment and try it out. And you'll find as you go across the country that even scientists who say these words say them different. I say serotina. Some people say serotina. It's the same thing. Don't feel bad. Don't be intimidated. We put a guide to pronunciation in our book, but you can also go on bugguide.net, and I believe all of the genera have their pronunciations in there, so you can look there to see how.
Okay, so Randall asked what size hole you would suggest, I'm guessing, for a bee house.
Right, so it can vary. Bees come in a lot of different shapes. Going bigger than, 3/8 an inch, I think? I think it's 5/8. Let's say a half. Let's split the difference and say a half. Go for a ½ inch or smaller. Maybe put a variety of different holes and see what you get in them because different bees will go in different ones. Length is really important. Shoot for making your nest holes 5 to 7 inches long. And someone asked me recently where that number comes from. And frankly, I cannot find a citation, but that's just generally what's accepted. The point is if you make your bee nest too short, the length of the hole that you drill too short, it encourages the bee to lay more male eggs than female eggs. And then you want to try and keep the sex ratio as even as possible.
Okay, there's a question about early weeds like lamium, speedwell, bittercress, and whether they are important as sources of pollen for early bees. Sure,
lamium I know is speedwell. Is that Veronica? Mm-hmm, Veronica can be, yeah. That can be good. I've caught a lot of bees on it. You know, I can't think of a flowering plant that bees avoid. There will be something that will try it out. Some may be more popular than others, but they typically, so I will say this, red flowers are less visited. It's not to say they aren't visited. Bees don't have color receptors for red colors, so they often see them as some sort of UV blue or UV green or something like that, because they do see ultraviolet. And they tend not to visit those quite as often. Flowers with tubes, so penstemons or gilias or other tubular honeysuckle, flowers like that, you may limit the number of bees that go in them because of the size constraint. So really big bees can't fit in there, and they may be tempted to rob nectar from the back instead. So big open flowers are more likely, big open flowers that aren't red are more likely to have a lot of bees on them. But you'll probably get bee visitors to just about anything.
Roxanne wonders, and she's one of our pollinator specialists who's doing outreach, and she's wondering when you do talks, because I know you present a lot to the public, if you would suggest using common names?
I really don't like common names because they're so variable. Polyester bee, cellophane bee are names for the exact same thing, whereas there's just the one genus name, Colletes, and you know exactly what you're talking about. That being said, you have to bridge the gap between your audience. And if they've heard of bees before, it's probably been a common name. So you have to bridge that gap and try and use both and work towards using a name that's more specific. But there is a place for using those common names as a way to communicate with people who aren't right up front familiar with them.